continuing part one. We're now to gazelles, little guys with the spiral horns, antelopes, not huge antelopes, maybe about the size of white-tailed deer, maybe a little bit smaller. First question, living in groups. Now, they're not really a social group. They literally just kind of hang together. And when you're trying to come up with an advantage, think in terms of you're in this group that you're, barely associating with. But you do have a bunch of other individuals around you while you're out, doing your daily grass eating or, sitting at night. What advantage does that give an individual under those circumstances? And what disadvantages do you get from being kind of always locked into this group or sometimes not locked into this group? The second question has to do with a feature that's very, very, very common in grass eaters, in white-tailed deer as well as gazelles and moose and horses and cows, is a long neck. Think in terms of what they normally eat as well as what they could eat. You can come up with advantages going either way on that. But also think of advantages in terms of how they might relate to predators, and disadvantages is how they might relate to predators. Now, some group animals will stampede. They'll spook and they'll clump and they'll run as a group. Gazelles don't do that. Gazelles, shoo, they disperse. The way that a flock of birds typically disperses. And they just run in whatever direction they're pointed. So, very, very chaotic. Think about that in terms of the advantage for any particular gazelle in a group that's doing that, and potential disadvantages in the group for any particular gazelle when they're doing that. Giraffes, there's an easy one. The long neck is both advantages and disadvantages are fairly easy to come up with there. Rhinoceros, built very differently from gazelles, not a particularly long neck. There's a clue to the long neck advantage. Its head is very close to the ground. Think about what's on the head of a rhinoceros in terms of what advantage that gives. And when you're in a grassland, think of the disadvantages that it gives to something like a rhinoceros. They are big animals, but their heads are pretty close to the ground. Pretty much, not all the time, but close. And then their senses is that whereas gazelles, pretty good visual animals, can see fairly well, can smell fairly well. Rhinoceroses definitely slide over to the nose side. That's not their nose, but they've got a really good nose. Don't have the best eyes in the world. Advantage, disadvantage, not hard to come up with. That brings us to baboons, who were primates. Ancestors lived in the jungles. As the jungles shrank and there were forming grasslands, is that some of the baboons' ancestors started to take advantage of these new conditions. And some of our ancestors took advantage of the new conditions. For people to go, if we evolved from chimpanzees, why are there still chimpanzees? Well, and chimps both evolved from ancestors that were much more like chimps than they are like us. But we both have evolved since. It's just we've evolved for a totally different set of conditions. So we've become fairly different from the chimps. The chimps stayed in conditions similar to their ancestors, haven't changed anywhere near as much. But once you're out in the open, and these features for baboons are things that our ancestors are also adaptations in us. The ability to not just be plant eaters, but to eat almost anything you run across other than roughage. There actually are some species of baboons that can eat grass. But for the most part, they're, fruits and nuts and berries and bugs and, whatever small animals they run across, they'll dig up roots and eat them. Excuse me, very omnivorous compared to us. And we're very omnivorous. Our ancestors were much less so. When you look at a group of baboons, it's a fairly large group, fairly decent number of adult males, which is a little tricky. And so they have this very complex societal order, where on the one hand, different jobs tend to be portioned out to different individuals. Like, you know, if digging up roots is a really good thing, you'll have a few members of the group that's their job for the most part. They're digging in the soil, finding roots. And when they find roots, is that they're not the only ones who get to eat them. Everybody gets to eat them. Some of them are hunters. Some of them are lookouts, where they're not providing food to the group, but they're doing something useful. So that's part of the social order. Also, you have this, what they originally called, because that works in chickens, pecking orders, where everybody isn't fighting for the same level in the group. Is that at your level, you have a certain amount of control over whoever's below you, and a certain bit of conflict with the people that are next to you, and you're trying to get farther up because there's more privileges and more power and more access to females and that sort of thing as you go up. Again, not that different from what humans faced with the same sort of conditions wound up developing. The third one's really easy because if you read through it, it kind of gives you the advantage. But baboons overreact to things, is that they're nasty, is that they see a potential threat, like there's a leopard somewhere, one of the lookouts spots a leopard, and the leopard's not coming toward them, it's just in sight, is a group of the males will go out and drive the leopard away, and in a way where they actually do engage with it. They can't probably kill it, but they can, beat the crap out of it enough to make it go. And here's a clue. And think twice the next time they run into a baboon. Same thing with people. If you're out in the open spaces, there's a lot of predators that will see you apparently all alone, but they'll avoid you anyway. Even way back before we could possibly be carrying guns or anything. So advantage to that. Think about that sort of attitude within the group when you're thinking of disadvantages. Now we're to humans. Every one of these things in the humans actually sets up an advantage for the next one on the list. So the advantages should be relatively easy to come up with. Like, walking on two legs, freeing up your hands. What's the next thing on the list? Ability to carry things. Think in terms of what the disadvantage because walking on two legs, if you're not a bird, that's an unusual thing. It's us and the kangaroos and not a heck of a lot of other animals. There's definite comparative advantages to being on four legs versus our two legs. But onto the ability to carry things, then we can pick stuff up and bring it somewhere else. Think about what gets carried under those circumstances. And one of the things that our ancestors could carry is almost certainly responsible for our smarts and our excessive smarts compared to even other smart primates. That one I don't expect you to come up with, but if you do, it's, our relatives do make tools. They dig stuff out, they poke stuff in to get bugs out of things and, eat the bugs off the stick. So they do make tools. But they make the tool on the spot, and then they leave it, and if they need it again, they make it on the spot. We make tools that last, that are reusable, that are durable. And there should be a pretty obvious advantage to that. There are other advantages that you have to think about in terms of like long-term developments in technology. And there's disadvantages not that hard to come up with. Our ancestors were nomadic. Primates the group kind of picks up and moves every day, settles for the night, builds some nests, very quickly, and then the next day they're onward. They may stay a couple of days in one place, but they don't tend to settle in spots the way that our ancestors eventually did. They set up a camp system where you moved, but when you settled someplace, you intended to stay there for a while and exploit that particular area for a while. There's a clue. What are the advantages of doing that? And what are the disadvantages of working an area for a while? What you find in our groups is, unlike, there is a certain level of societal chicken, pecking orders, but there's a lot of equality across, classically, we're talking about ancient, ancestor of humans across the males, and this females, unfortunately, at a different lower rung of the ladder, which no longer really applies anymore, but this is where it came from. But what you find out in a structure of lots and lots of males, where the job of the males often involves being gone for a while, going out on hunting parties, going out on raiding parties, eventually going off to war and that sort of thing, is that the development of what we think of as marriage, a long-term monogamous relationship between a male in the group and a female in the group, and then the two of them being mostly responsible for the children that they have. That's a tricky one to come up with advantages and disadvantages for, but I want you to give it a try. And then our ability to communicate with language, to tell people things that rather than just point. That one's a fairly easy one to come up with advantages for. And if you think about the long haul of human evolution and the fact that we have languages, it's not that hard to come up with disadvantages for that. So that's part one. I said I was going to try to split this up, so I'm going to go and we'll do part two on a separate video.